Welcome to Insights to Activate, Ipsos' new series focusing on some of the biggest topics facing the world. Our topic for this expert panel is one that's hugely important to all Americans, the election, and why businesses need to plan for the outcomes today. I'm Ben Meyerson, Director of Marketing and Communications here at Ipsos, and I'll be your host as we explore possible election outcomes and how to prepare. We have a brilliant panel who I'll introduce you to in a moment, with experts from the Ford Motor Company, Regeneron Pharmaceuticals, and of course, my colleagues here at Ipsos. But before we hear from them, let's walk through the lay of the land in 2024, starting with our forecasts for the election and scenarios that businesses need to know and prepare for today. By Ipsos' count, there will be 70 major elections in countries around the world in 2024. That's the biggest year for democracy in the history of the world. More people will be able to vote in 2024 than ever before. But it would be hard to find anyone in the US or around the world who believes any election is more significant than the rematch between President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump. So, what's going to happen? Obviously, we don't know. But based on historical models and current data, we can make some guesses. Here's what Ipsos thinks. If the election were held today, with Biden's approval rating around 40%, polling showing Biden and Trump in a near tie, and the economy as the main issue, we predict that Donald Trump would win. But the election is not being held today, obviously. So what happens if current trends continue? If public opinion continues to catch up with the improving economy, Biden's approval rating and standing in the polls could improve as well. And if threats to democracy overtake the economy as the main issue, we think Biden would win. And of course, there are major events that could happen in the next 4.5 months that we don't expect, like a war, a pandemic, or a major death. Call these black swan events. Unpredictable, but always possible. So, those are the possibilities. How do you plan for those as a business? We've worked out some scenarios for 4 possible outcomes. While it's possible that either the Democrats or the Republicans could land a huge victory and take the White House and both the House and the Senate, we think it's most likely we end up with a narrow victory. That would mean one party running the White House and another party with at least partial control of Congress. And at this point, it's looking highly likely that either of those could happen. But they would have wildly different implications for businesses, especially highly regulated businesses. So you need to plan for those today. Let's meet our panel.
I'm Dennis Sikowski. I'm the Director of Insights for Ford Motor Company, working on a global team that gathers data all across the globe and works in multiple markets.
Sarah Feldman, Editorial Director here at Ipsos. I work on our news media polling and do thought leadership at Ipsos around the election, among many other topics.
Jennifer Bender, Associate Partner at Ipsos Strategy 3, which is our in-house consultancy, and I specialize in trends and foresight.
Jack Quinn, Head of State Government Relations for Regeneron Pharmaceuticals.
Great. So glad to have you all here today. Sarah, as our political expert on the team here, can you tell us a little bit about how you got to this forecast?
It's a great question. It's one that I get from my grandma, friends, strangers on the street. Who's going to win and how do you know that? The way we systematically approach the things that we do know by collating different indicators and models, namely our polling models, that's looking at who's ahead, who's down, our heuristics or rule of thumb models, so that's looking at kind of the vibes, the main issue, fundraising, and then our fundamentals model, and that's looking at presidential approval rating that Ben mentioned at the top and incumbency and advantages associated with that. And taking that picture all together, that's where we land in this very toss-up territory with the slight lean towards Trump, but some improvement for Biden potentially in the future. Now, like I said, there are some things that we do know, and there are just some things that we don't know and can't know until they happen. And that's the unforeseen wild card black swan events that Ben was referencing at the top. Those are things like a recession, a pandemic, thinking back to the last election, and any developments around the Trump trials or the wars in the world that could flare up and really change the shape of the election and how Americans are relating to that and the candidates involved. So long story short, toss up, lean towards Trump, slight improvements for Biden maybe in the future, but there's just a lot that we don't know between now and November.
Jennifer, so where does this put us? How do businesses plan for these?
Well, Ben, we've published the 4 scenarios based on the information and the predictions that Sarah was talking about to really give a sense of the spectrum of what could happen. Everything from a blue wave where there's a strong control of Democratic locus of control, all the way through to the more likely scenarios of, Biden winning, Trump winning with less of a mandate, through to a red wave. The reason that we have that spectrum of scenarios is that even though at either end of the spectrum, they're less likely, it's helpful to use that as a framing tool when you're talking to your stakeholders internally. So when you're talking to your teams at Ford, for example, showing the outlier events and really understanding what the extremes could be helps to put into context what the more likely scenarios could be as well. And it's important not to ignore those extremes, but to plan for them. And that's really the heart of scenario planning, is to think about multiple futures that could happen and to prepare your business for that eventuality.
Dennis, let's ask you a little bit more about this. So how does the auto industry deal with shifting sands? Obviously, it takes a long time for a vehicle to come to market, and then obviously it's there for a while being sold.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question as well. I mean, the way the industry tends to work on development cycles, it can take anywhere from 3 to 5 years to develop a vehicle. So the projects that are being put into the product development pipeline right now won't hit the market for several years. So the 2 drivers that we take a really hard look at and try to basically through scenario planning determine what might be happening are kind of the emission standards. That's really the one that's been in place for the longest period of time and does tend to fluctuate over time. So that really affects our planning. Another thing that can affect kind of the planning and taking a look at variables that can go into the scenario planning has to do with regulation and policy outside of those items. So those are the things that even small changes can introduce a lot of factors that we have to consider from a powertrain perspective. So the powertrains that go in the vehicles. Over time, I think you've seen a growth in hybrid powertrains. Our competitor, Toyota, introduced the first hybrid vehicle in 1999, and it's taken close to 20 years for consumers to understand that technology and the benefits. So the reason I'm even mentioning a competitor and a powertrain specifically is because consumer education, awareness, and adoption take a long time. Regulation and policy can impact that, but the data that we have, and it may be similar to the data that Ipsos has as well, show that consumers want choice to select the powertrain and the vehicle that most meets their needs. And I think the final thing I'd say is every household does very complicated calculus on adding a vehicle to the household. So it's not just one vehicle to one vehicle replacement. It's what is the job that vehicle needs to do for that family or that consumer, and what's the best choice. So we take all those things into consideration when we're planning the portfolio as well as the powertrains.
And I'm so glad you mentioned consumers too, because it's equally important and perhaps more important for us as business leaders to think about what is the consumer going to do in this kind of a place, which is less really tied to the type of legislation that's being passed. And it's more about the vibes, as Sarah was saying.
Yeah.
How are people feeling?
Yeah. No, very true. The consumer attitudinal data and working that into kind of a behavioral economics approach is really starting to take root.
And we know in different scenarios that people act differently. Citizens act differently. They're not just consumers, but they do have that other political life that they're bringing into some of the decisions and feelings they have going about their day-to-day world. So really important to be thinking about them holistically in that way.
Jack, when you're talking about developing pharmaceutical products, obviously this is something that you have to deal a lot with the shifting sands of regulation as well. It takes a long time to develop a drug, and there are lots of factors out there besides just the political environment, but they totally can affect the environment in which that drug arrives. How do you deal with all that?
Well, first of all, Sarah, I'm glad I'm not the only one who gets questions from people all the time. As the political guy, people think I should know more than I probably know. And as you said, the vibe, I'm not really sure what the vibe is now, but I do know this. It is a long time till Election Day, and a lot can happen. I think your report was fantastic in terms of laying out the different scenarios as to where we stand today and where we could stand. That black swan event, I think, is something that we always look at in terms of how, something may happen in October, right, that we didn't even see today that happens down the road. Healthcare is always an issue that is tops for people, right? And Dennis, as you said, it's about people want choice, right? You and I share a lot in terms of what people want, even though we're in different industries. There are four major players in healthcare. You have the payers, you have providers, you have drug companies, you have PBMs. All four of us would like to tell you that we're doing what's best for patients and caregivers right at the end of the day. All of that, though, is a mix of what I would call balancing access and affordability, right? At some point, if you have all the access in the world, then it won't be affordable. If it's extremely affordable, though, you're going to impact access, right? So, I would tell folks that I work with, you're probably going to see more of the same from a healthcare perspective, I think. And there's three probably big reasons for that. First and foremost, no matter who's in charge, whether you have, blue wave, red wave, or anything in between, it's really tough to get 60 votes in the U.S. Senate, right? That is a really tough thing to do. And the only way that you're going to get something in terms of the legislature is going to be whether an omnibus piece of legislation or reconciliation, something that happens that it's passed through one big bill, right? I think the regulatory changes, which quite honestly, since the Bush administration, George W. Bush, have been the way that people have tried to get policy done in DC, is going to be what you see going forward. And I like to call it regulation plus litigation, right? There's this regulation that happens and then somebody sues, and it seems like we go from administration to administration to administration, and these things continue on. And then in the last part about healthcare is that no matter if you have one wave or another, one party or the other, the age we live in terms of social media platforms, in terms of if you're in the minority or majority, you still have the bully pulpit in order to kind of call hearings and bring people up to Capitol Hill. No matter what happens in November, there are going to be, and you mentioned those four participants, members of Congress that are going to say one or the other is good or bad, right? So you're still going to have folks who are going to say that drug manufacturers are awful, or PBMs are awful, or payers are awful. So that sort of media swirl is not going to be gone no matter who takes office come January. There are a few issues. I think PBM reform. I think maybe some tax reform. The Trump tax cuts are going to be coming up in 2025, so that'll be a big issue, especially if President Trump is elected again. I think you could have other issues that come up in terms of China, in terms of security issues, right? Supply chain issues, which would be an impact to you guys as well, right? But I think it's not going to be that different. I think you're still going to see healthcare as a top priority. Tough to get things done, but an issue that is not going away one way or another.
Jack, can I ask you quickly to define PBM? All of our audience may not be familiar with that term, and go a little bit into more about how that might be shifting in the upcoming year or two? Sure.
Pharmacy benefit managers who work, they're involved in kind of how we work with drug manufacturers, how drug manufacturers work with insurance companies, payers, right? And they serve as a middleman. Historically, PBMs served a very important purpose, right? You can't have a situation where health plans are working with every drug company out there. So they helped drug companies and manufacturers and wholesalers and everyone work together in terms of what offerings were going to be provided for health plans. Over time, though, they have gotten a lot of scrutiny. And I think over the last probably 5 or 6 years specifically. This year, as we kind of come to the end of the congressional season here and schedule to head off into the summer and with elections coming up, even with all the with the infighting happening in Washington, PBM reform was at the top of the list. And I think a lot of people thought it would get done. No matter what happens in November, I think there is still a pathway for PBM reform. I think there's a lot of interest. It's one of those bipartisan issues. Republicans and Democrats kind of come together to say, this is something that's been left unchecked for a while and something we need to work on.
Interesting. And Dennis, I'm going to throw it to you now because I think Jack laid down an interesting question about China's impact on the market. And that's obviously something that is a factor when you look at the automotive industry as well.
Yeah, no, it's a huge impact. I mean, I think what we see is the pace of innovation and the speed with which Chinese vehicle manufacturers can bring products to market is unlike anything we've ever seen. It does seem to hit on a desire that consumers have for technology-fueled vehicles that can refresh and receive software updates over the air and keep their operating system up to date. And it also brings up an interesting question around country of origin. We see a lot of consumers are not aware where their vehicle was manufactured. But I see kind of a coming tide where companies are going to need to address where they're sourcing their vehicles and what their supply chain looks like. Younger consumers, the data that we have shows that they are less prone to being concerned about country of origin or country of manufacture. We probably all have iPhones or something that was manufactured not in the United States. So it is an interesting question, and it's one we're just right on the cusp of seeing probably a pretty big impact in the coming years.
And it's a big factor as well in some of the more recent legislation that we've seen. Country of origin for parts of vehicles is a big factor in some of the more recent incentives that have come out of the U.S. government.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. It is something that could potentially fundamentally affect where supply chain decisions are made. On the consumer side, I'm not being lazy here with this response, but I'll default back to the fact that people want the freedom to choose the product that best meets their needs. And so if that means that they have to kind of look past certain factors around supply chain, there's plenty of evidence, not necessarily in automotive, but in other consumer products that point to they're willing to do that to get the best product and the best value for them.
Sarah, we've done some industry-specific polling on both healthcare and automotive infrastructure. What can you tell us about what you've learned from that and how that plays into this larger conversation?
Yeah, there's a lot of great stuff there. Jack queued me up great, talking about a lot of the trends that are built in there, particularly in the healthcare space, that sense of polarization, the low trust environment. That is one of the key parts of American public life right now and American political life really come into play forcefully in the healthcare industry when we look at polling around there. When we ask Americans whether they trust the government, federal government, to act on healthcare, to prioritize their health and well-being, there's very low levels of trust and agreement, responding to some of that polarization I think they see and feel every day. Of course, cost and access is a concern, just as Jack said. And we see that policies that really address some of those key and deeply felt feelings are widely supported. But of course, when we bring in that partisan lens, partisan priming, we see opinions start to fracture along those predictable partisan lines. Now, the automotive industry, we've just released a lot of really interesting polling on electric vehicles. And I'm sure, as we've all seen day to day, year to year, there are more electric vehicles on the road than ever before. And we're certainly seeing that in our polling now. The interesting piece, the interesting finding from that latest release last month was that there's this really key group of Americans who are open to getting an EV, but aren't quite there yet. They're not that early adopter group. And they need a little bit more nudging, a little bit more encouragement to go along, to take that leap, to take that next step. And we do see policies potentially help there among Americans who are open to EVs, but don't own one already. Things like state, local, federal subsidies, free public charging station, being able to charge in your home or near your home makes a really big difference in helping those consumers get to where they need to go. But to just wrap this all up, I think the key thing that I think Jack and Dennis can really appreciate is that this is where Americans are right now. This is where Americans are today, but getting them to move or change behaviors or actions is, of course, another bigger uphill battle from where we are right now.
No, that's a great point, particularly on EV adoption. The term that we're using is trying to uncover what is the true natural demand and what are those tipping points that kind of underlie the natural demand drivers, and what can be done both from a consumer perspective to motivate them. Manufacturers have only a few levers we can pull by just putting the best product out there. There are elements of consumer education and things like that could also contribute to it, but it's a pretty heavy lift for the industry. So relying on favorable regulation and policy to drive that, and having consumers understand that there is a private benefit and a public good, maybe equation that they can balance to then push them into a state where they can make an EV work for them.
Jennifer, what can you tell us about what kind of forces are driving all this polarity and uncertainty? Do we have any case studies or client impact stories that you could share?
It's a good question, and I'm glad that Dennis mentioned, looking at the public benefit versus the private benefit. One of the things that we've been working on in our forthcoming Ipsos Global Trends study is understanding all of the macro forces, what's happening in the world around citizens and around consumers that are impacting their behavior. And that's a big one. It's a shift from really looking at society as a community, looking at a community as a community, and focusing more on the individual. It's something that started to happen before the pandemic. So we think of it as something that got worse during the pandemic, but really it's something that began long before that. And there are a number of studies that are coming out that we're tracking that really show that there has been this wholesale shift in American culture from the collective to the individual. And that's part of the reason that you see individual decisions really focusing on the benefit to me or the problem for me. That obviously causes some problems when we get into contentious political situations. The other thing that we're seeing, of course, is the impact of technology. We were talking earlier about 10, 20 years ago, there really wasn't the impact of technology. We didn't have smartphones, we didn't have social media, there weren't filter bubbles. So it's really a very different technological landscape that, as we all know, is influencing behavior and creating smaller and smaller and smaller circles of where we get our information from. Now, that's because the tech platforms and social media are built to feed us more of what we like. But the downside of that, of course, is that we hear more of what we're used to. We don't hear other opinions. So those two pieces of wholesale change in the way that we view the world, as well as technological influence, are creating a much more divisive political environment in terms of the discourse that we're having as citizens.
Any way that we think that's filtering down, not just to the individual, but also back out to politics?
I think that's one of the defining features of politics right now. The media ecosystem, the fractured media ecosystem, and the filter bubbles that everyone are living through really make the other side seem bigger, stronger, scarier. And that's kind of contributing to this negative polarization. That would be the industry term for that. So it's really, Jennifer hit the nail on the head in terms of the trends, and I think pushing that along, the media trends along with just the way the political environment is set up and playing out right now.
And it kind of filters out to not only the politics, but then your politics that can then impact your brand choices as well from there, depending on which bubble you're living in.
Absolutely. And I would say we've done work with clients in the past and today, especially this year, around how do you navigate that. So we've done a large study with one of our clients around navigating the future of gender as one example of a very politically contentious topic that's coming up, not just this year, but especially in the past 2 years. So in terms of a client impact case study, what it really means is unpacking the spectrum of opinions around that, understanding and empathizing with consumers and citizens who are coming at these issues from very different perspectives, and trying to figure out as a brand, what role do you play? What role should you play? How do you navigate this issue in a way that really speaks to your brand purpose, but that also doesn't alienate your core consumers? So it's really kind of finding how to navigate that pathway. And so we've been building a lot of playbooks this year that use the scenarios, use our attitudinal research, use this understanding of how people are interacting to be able to guide a specific brand for a specific industry to say, this is how we're going to navigate this really tricky issue with a deeper understanding of where people are coming from, what the implications for you as a business, not just in terms of marketing and messaging externally, but internally as well. How do you work with your employees to make sure that their needs are being met through these difficult issues like the future of gender?
Easy stuff.
Thank you both. I think it's time to go to some Q&A from our audience here. Let me check and see what kind of questions we have coming in. All right, so this one I think is pretty clearly to Dennis. So are you working to shorten vehicle development timelines to deal with uncertainty in the future?
I guess the short answer, no pun intended, is yes, we're working on shortening that time frame. Some of the things that are really helping in that regard are the increasing amount of digital and experiences and services that are available in the vehicle. So that allows us to really kind of take a look at the vehicle as a technology connected, software enabled product. And so that's allowing us to kind of simplify some of the lead times that we have when we're developing products. Another thing that we're doing, and you might expect this from someone that's in consumer insights, is we're really leaning into a deep understanding of the customer so that we can very quickly then proceed with vehicle development. So that is also kind of like reducing timelines. On the engineering and manufacturing side, can't really speak to the details there, but I know that part of the business is really putting forth a lot of effort to speed up and reduce cycle time.
Let's see, another one here. So you need to plan for multiple futures, obviously. That's what we've been talking about here. But is there a way how do you try to get to the one you want? Jack, some would call you a lobbyist if they were simplifying your title. So I think that's really up your alley and what you do day to day. So what can you tell us about that?
That is true. I think we are in a golden age of healthcare technology right about now. I think that we're at a time where the advancements in oncology, cancer care are better than ever. We're seeing, diseases such as cystic fibrosis, where 20 years ago, people were only living to their 30s. There's now treatments out there that people can live to their 50s or 60s. Like get married, have kids if they want to, buy a home, all this type of stuff that if you had cystic fibrosis was not even an option for you 20 years ago. The advancements that have been made in HIV and AIDS treatment, we never thought were possible 40 years ago, right, during the AIDS and HIV epidemic. Not to speak of rare diseases. I mean, the rare disease treatments that we see today, for many families and patients, that this is the only option between life and death, right? If not for this treatment, that child will die, right? So that's where we are. The cell and gene therapy horizon, I think, is amazing. The fact that we can go in and actually alter people's biology in a way that you can eradicate certain diseases almost completely. And guess what? Whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or anybody in between, you have these concerns, right? So I think that's the most important part, is that you only don't get cancer or get cystic fibrosis if you're a Republican or a Democrat. I think for us, it's education. It's talking about, and talking with patients and providers around the impact that this healthcare technology is having on families and patients and caregivers. And the more we educate and you talk about access and affordability, I think the stronger that message gets, right? So it's building out what I like to consider to be an ecosystem, right? An ecosystem where you're talking about innovation and the innovation that's happening in the healthcare spectrum and continue to happen. As Sarah mentioned, people are going back to their corners nowadays, right? Where Republicans are going to listen to Republican things, Democrats are going to listen to Democratic things, and it's getting, from my opinion, worse than ever before. I think the ability to bridge that and talk about healthcare innovation is one of the ways that we can get out of it.
So this one is a bit of a drag on me. So we talked about the rest of the world having elections this year, but we only really talked about America. Now, of course, we are here in the U.S., but there is a valid conversation there about how these other elections around the world, again, 70 total, more than ever before in terms of people voting, how is that going to shape this landscape?
It's an important question, and it's a big one right now. Like you said, 2024 is the biggest election year in human history. Democracy is kind of on the ballot in some ways. Over 4 billion people will be heading to the polls. And really, from my perspective, what is on the ballot is democracy and populism. What are the directions populism around the world what will it be taking? Is it on the ascent, descent? Will populist leaders be voted in or out of office? And at Ipsos, we do a lot of work around populism. We do see that as one of the big structural trends that is framing a lot of the insights that we are getting on the day-to-day or week-to-week basis. And we really measure that by looking at our System is Broken index. It's an index we developed in Latin America in the early 2000s, and it really measures discontent with the political establishment and a willingness among the public to break rules or have leaders break rules and norms as a reaction to that. And looking at that index, we can see that populism is widespread. There's a widespread sense that things are not working, that the system is broken, and that is being filtered out and being played across many of these different elections around the world. So what does that mean for January 2025 when this is all said and done? We could be looking at a very different regulatory and political environment coming out of that. So that's definitely a space to watch, to seeing how populists play out across the world in many different elections.
All right, I think we have time for one more here. So this is a great one to wrap it up on. So you have this knowledge, but how do you apply it? Do you just sit and wait, or do it now? And I'll throw this one to you now, Jennifer.
As the futurist on the panel, I think that's a good question. Although I'm biased, I would say you never sit and wait. You do need to address the future and be prepared for it. I think one of the things that we started to talk about earlier was, how do you shape the future? And we like to think of it in terms of a cone of possibilities. There are many factors that go into the future, not just around the election, but in terms of all the things, all the change that's happening around us every day. And one of the things that we like to talk about when we discuss this with clients is the idea of, within that cone of possibilities, the further out we get from today, the wider the cone becomes, because there's so many factors at play. That can be very scary when you walk into a room with your stakeholders and your senior executives and say, we don't know what's going to happen. So one of the things that we like to frame up those conversations is saying bridging the idea of preferable futures, and saying, hey, this is not just something that we don't have control over. We do have control through lobbyists, but we do have control in many different factors. We have levers that we can pull internally. We have lots of things that we can shape, consumer perception with, through messaging, through branding, through brand purpose work. So by looking at all of the different levers that we can pull and what we can control, we can then apply all of those opportunities to be able to create the future that we want. So that idea of preferable futures is something that is really kind of helps turn the conversation around to something that's more productive. But I think that going into those conversations requires two things that we're seeing from clients. One, I think it takes a lot of courage to go into the room and say, we don't know what's going to happen, and it might be bad, but let's sit down as a team, as a leadership team, as a team of stakeholders within your organization, and let's figure it out. What would happen? Let's put all the cards on the table, talk about what the implications are for the business. Some of it's going to be bad. What will we do then? And then I think the flip side of that is not just having the courage, but also having the creativity. As you go into those conversations, you really need to be willing to kind of let your guard down and be creative and think creatively about what the future could look like, inserting a little bit of fun and elements of play into those conversations, and a little bit of brainstorming really kind of helps people get into the frame of mind that's necessary for really focusing on the future and creating those preferable futures.
I think that is a fantastic note to end on. I really think that we were very creative today in laying out exactly how we're going to deal with all this uncertainty. But I think that we came to some interesting conclusions about how to do that. So I just want to thank you all for coming today. Dennis, Sarah, Jennifer, Jack. It's been fantastic having this conversation with you. So thank you. And thank you all for joining us. If you haven't yet, I highly recommend reading our companion report, which explores each of these scenarios and what they mean for businesses in the US and around the world. We have one more piece of the Insights to Activate election series coming, a client impact story, talking about how Ipsos has worked with political consultancy the Eurasia Group to improve the firm's election forecasting. And join us after that for our next topic, how brands can use context to grow amid the chaos of the modern world.